if it were not for German mission societies. The Wells's background was very humble beginnings. There was three congregations in the Milwaukee area who banded together in 1850. Just three. They didn't have hardly a dime between them. They had no money, but they had a big dream, big hopes, big vision, and they knew that together is better. So they banded together and formed what became the Wells. The Missouri Synod had a little different, actually a lot different background. They arrived as a colony of immigrants. 3,000 people came on 4 ships, landed in New Orleans, went up the Mississippi River, and got off the boat in southeast Missouri. Already with pastors, with a whole bunch of business people, farmers, and tradespeople who were going to be living in the cities. And they started already, they had a worker training school, which became the Concordia Seminary in St. Louis, right out of the gate. The Wells had to limp along without a functioning seminary for 30 years. The Wells was founded in 1850, but did not actually have a functioning seminary for training pastors that they managed for 30 years. It was not until 1880 that they finally had a school in Milwaukee. Eventually bounced around a few places and ended up in Mequon, Wisconsin. Some of you had the fun of visiting the seminary campus in Mequon, which is where it is today. But it took the Wells 30 years to have one. And if God wasn't generous enough with the Missouri Synod, he moved the heart of an societies in Germany whose name was Loehe, Loehe, who basically gave the Missouri Synod a second seminary already in the 1840s, which is still today functioning as Concordia Fort Wayne. That school also moved around a little bit during its history, had a long residence in Springfield, Illinois for a while, and then in the 1970s moved back to Fort Wayne, and there it is today. So the Missouri Synod even today has 2 seminaries. So they had a steady supply of workers, and those are the reasons why the Missouri Synod outgrew the Wells. The Wells, when the early Lutherans in the United States first began organizing in groups beyond just congregations, their usual MO was when there was enough of a critical mass, they would form a synod, an SYNOD. The one at Gettysburg, what is that one? Gettysburg is a college and seminary today that is part of, was originally part of one of the Pennsylvania synods. Today it is part of the ELCA's education system, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. These state synods, they borrowed the word from the Greek language. It means literally to have a common path together, that you're on the same road together. The Missouri Synod, though, was different from the rest in that they did not grow by mergers of different state synods together. They had a dream of doing that, but nobody wanted to play along. The Missouri Synod just grew because of their position. They were known as the more Lutherans, stricter. Sometimes they were nicknamed as an insult old Lutherans. That they were very they were very strict. They also were an immigrant synod. Missouri Synod was founded in 1847, and like the Wells, was completely German-speaking for at least 50 years before they started to move into English. Now, that, of course, is one of the reasons why the initial Lutheran church in the Midwest stayed so white. They only spoke German. How many black folks, are really, want to go to church in the German language? Pretty much zero. So I'm going to tell my story today in 3 areas. One is the immigrant era, when the goal was just to survive, to figure out how to navigate this new world, which was English speaking, and here you are, a bunch of immigrants. So that's both a blessing and a curse. In the short term, it's a phenomenal blessing because you've got a value proposition of giving immigrants like you, stressed and alone and getting taken advantage of all the time by the English and the Irish who are English speaking. They had their own like little subculture. It's like the same reason why in a diverse high school, for instance, the black kids like to eat together. It's like your comfort zone. You get to clump together because we're all basically tribal, and so that tribalism in the early Lutheran Church in the U.S. meant that the groups clumped together depending on where they had come from, and then slowly got more missional. So I'm going to tell my story in three eras. There's the immigrant era. There is, I'll call it the missional era, where white Lutherans always cared about other people beyond them, other people's spiritual welfare. And they began already in the years right after the Civil War, began to invest in ways to share the gospel with people of color. And then I'll call it today the integrated era. And the game, those are three completely different games. And the drivers for eras one and two are like gone now. We are now in the third era. But those first two eras explain why we are where we are today. But I want to start with a little bit of a look at the world. The European Lutheran mission societies were very energetic in sharing the gospel, not only with people like them, but they were early on very mission minded as well. And they sent missionaries and planted churches in a lot of places in the world besides just the U.S. And the Lutheran sending countries were established state churches. So sent the states, the provinces and regions of central and northern Germany, Denmark, and Sweden and Norway. Iceland was pretty small, so they weren't big players in this. But the Northern European mission agencies not only sent resources to what became the United States, but also to Africa long ago. And Africa today is like the center of gravity of Lutheranism. There's way more Lutherans in Africa than the U.S. So when I say that Lutheranism looks really white, I'm only speaking about the world that you can see right here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Africa has got 10 times, well, maybe that's a little higher, and probably 8 times as many Lutherans as the United States. And most of them are black. So to say that Lutheranism is white, that's only partly true. The state churches of Europe have now bought into a lot of liberalism and progressivism, and Christianity in Europe is at a very low point right now. If you go and visit some of the beautiful and historic church buildings, if you ever have the opportunity to travel anywhere in Europe, there's going to be more tourists in church on a Sunday than actual worshipers. Germany is still officially a state church, so you're like Lutheran just by being born into it. So when Germany lists, we've got we've got so many numbers of millions of Lutherans. That's nominally only. People maybe get baptized because it's socially expected. Possibly they will get married in a Lutheran church if they get married at all. But the actual number of active church attending people who are doing teaching and learning and digging into the word is pathetically small. Europe has sunk to a very low level today. And the real energy in Lutheranism is in Africa. For instance, here's a few stats for you. The Lutheran Church of Tanzania is one of the big dogs. They have 8 million members. That's more, there are more Tanzanian Lutherans than United States Lutherans, and they're almost all black. Madagascar, the island off of Southeast Africa, 3 million. Namibia, what most people think of as just a dry, dusty desert in Southwest Africa, north and west of South Africa, Union of South Africa, has 500,000 members. They're way bigger. The black Lutherans just in Namibia are way bigger than the whole Wales, all put together. The Lutheran Church of Nigeria has 2.2 million people. Kenya, 100,000. Ethiopia has 10 million Lutherans. It's called the Church of Mekane Yesu. So to say Lutheranism is white, only if you're standing here and like if you're traveling around Minnesota, it's going to look real white. But in the rest of the world, Lutheranism is a black thing. And those churches maybe still receive occasional support, like financial support, from more wealthier nations in Europe and the U.S. But they basically run their own programs. They are led by Africans, and they are now independent and now, frankly, way bigger and have more energy going on. A friend of mine got a chance to meet the Bishop of Tanzania one time, and said, "Explain this to me. how come Lutheranism is exploding in Tanzania and it's struggling in the U.S.? And he said he didn't even think about it too long. He just answered, "You haven't suffered enough." And so the struggles and hardships that the peoples in East Africa, for instance, in Tanzania, are undergoing has actually been really good for the gospel. People are more aware of their need for God. The Europe and a lot of the U.S. is just too wealthy, too comfortable, and just don't need God too much. They got their own life, and they don't need any help from God. They don't notice anything missing, and they want to just play the game that they're doing fairly well at. It's sad to say, but actually, I think prosperity is a bigger enemy of the church than hardship and poverty. Poverty is no obstacle to having a relationship with your God. So I really think that the energy in Lutheranism today is in Africa, and that's been accelerating like crazy as Lutheranism in the U.S., at least measured by overall numbers, has been shrinking. Africa's exploding. Let's ponder that. In the Western Hemisphere, there were black Lutherans already in the 16 and 1700s, and where you'll notice that is where there were European countries where Lutheranism was tolerated and sort of encouraged, like the Netherlands. The Dutch were mainly Reformed, they're Calvinists, and the Dutch Reformed Church today is still a pretty strong microcosm of late Christianity. But the Dutch always had kind of close ties with Germany because they're so close, and so the Dutch colonies would often encourage Lutheran churches to do their work there. And already, as you read, now these are stories that you can read in fuller detail in Jeff Johnson's story, but there are very old efforts to communicate the gospel to the people who had been enslaved and were made to work in the sugar plantations in the Caribbean. And surprisingly enough, there still are today thriving black congregations of people whose ancestors had been slaves. And the two places that Jeff points out, you can read those stories, or I hope you have already, or you will. And I encourage you really to read those just to get a bigger sense that you are part of a movement that's way bigger than just Milwaukee, Wisconsin. In the Danish West Indies, now called, they then were renamed the Virgin Islands, and there's a British half and the U.S. half. The U.S. still manages as like a Commonwealth. The U.S. Virgin Islands, surprisingly robust black Lutheran churches there, because the Danes were Lutherans, and they kind of encouraged that. They were doing cross cultural mission work, as it were, and building black congregations way ahead of everybody else. Also in the northern coast of South America, not so much Venezuela, which was colonized by the Spanish, and so it would be Catholic. Their missionaries would be Catholic, and not Brazil, which because of the Portuguese. Brazil still is predominantly Catholic, although there is a very robust Pentecostal subculture in Brazil that is growing rapidly. It really seems to connect with people of African descent living in Brazil today. But in the tweener land between Brazil and Venezuela, those two big giants are the three Guianas. And believe it or not, the Dutch portion of that had a lot of Lutherans working there, and there was a surprising number of black Guianan Lutheran churches that are still there today. Jeff will tell you more about those. So those are kind of like the older black Lutherans in the Western Hemisphere and our part of the world. In the U.S., back to my story about synods, a couple of words about the way in which the main U.S. Lutheran organizations really developed. The Missouri Synod was its own thing and did not grow by mergers. In fact, the Missouri Synod only had one or two tiny mergers that really didn't affect them overall. They had their powerful seminaries, they had a publishing house, they were well organized and on their way, and managed to build a national organization right out of the chute in 1847. When the Wells was founded in 1850, it was three pastors, one city church, and then two in the farm country that now tend to be part of the Milwaukee metro area. The second one was Salem and Granville, which was Podunk Junction. That was just a farm crossroads in the 1840s. And then on the south side, St. John's and Oak Creek was basically a crossroads farm community as well. So that was the whole synod, the whole Wells in 1850. When the Missouri Synod signed its founding constitution in 1847, there obviously were representatives from St. Louis. That's the Missouri Synod's headquarters, even today. And that's why it's got its name, because its founding was in the state of Missouri, even though there's way more Missouri Synod Lutherans outside of Missouri than in Missouri. They are a global organization today. But besides St. Louis, there were congregations in Chicago, Baltimore, Detroit, and Fort Wayne that all were at that founding convention. So the Missouri Synod was a national organization from the get-go, and we're way ahead of the Wells. It's like the Wells started off kind of in a hole, and the Missouri Synod already had not one but two seminaries cranking out pastors to meet the needs of the rapidly expanding United States population. And they grew organically, not by merger. I mentioned how the Wells got started. The Wells had one significant pair of mergers. First, a federation, loosely bound together, and then stronger. With this Wisconsin Synod, the Wells always was probably the leading planter of churches in the state of Wisconsin. And they found that they were like-minded with the Minnesota Synod and one of the Michigan Synods. So they were federated in 1892 and then organically merged together in 1917, just at the time that the U.S. was entering the First World War. So even today, probably over 3/4 of Wells members live or go to congregations in those three states, and all the rest of the other 47 states together. All the Wells members that are added together would make up the other 25%. So the Wells today very strongly in the upper Midwest, those three states. The Wells also early on formed a fellowship with the Missouri Synod in 1872, and so that meant, and they had sort of gentlemen's agreements. So the Missouri Synod was strong in Chicago, and so the Wells said, well, we don't need to be there if you're there. So that's why today the Wells has only a tiny little sprinkling of presence in Chicago. You'd think that a big city like that, only 80 miles away from Milwaukee, that the Wells would have had a bigger story. It's because the Missouri Synod got there first, and the Wells said, you can take care of Chicago. Like, you can have Chicago, and we'll take Watertown, Wisconsin. That was thought to be a good trade-off. Even today, the Wells got Manitowoc, and so the Wells has a high school and a whole bunch of congregations in Manitowoc. And the Missouri Synod got Sheboygan. They did a gentleman's agreement. So the Missouri Synod has a big high school in Sheboygan and a whole cluster of churches, and not much at all going on in Manitowoc. So that's the Wells story. The ELCA has a much more complicated story. The ELCA today is a string of many mergers, probably numbering in the hundreds. They ended up scooping up everything that was loose and bonding them together in a great big organization. Now, if you have a continuum, let's say, for me, the key issue is whether or not to accept the authority of the Bible as being inspired and inerrant. And Lutherans do not have a common view of the Bible, I have to say. I wish I could say that Lutheranism always stood for complete embrace of the authority and content in Scripture given by God for us to learn from and then apply into our lives. That is not so. In fact, that's not only not true of Lutherans, it's not true of Christians in general. And you tended either the Bible is inspired, inerrant, and infallible. These are the three I's. Or it is a human document. And you can read in it for interesting stories, but you're much more likely to bring other factors to bear on how you set up your doctrinal belief system. For instance, science, what is fashionable socially, social learnings, Your own experiences are thought to have equal validity. The Wells, the Missouri Synod was over here, and God poured his blessings on them. The Wells used to be a little softer on that stuff, and the powerful leader of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, Dr. Carl Ferdinand Walther, the leading professor and president of the Missouri Synod in the middle 1800s, was such a powerful force. He persuaded the Wells to have a doctrinal position more on this end. And so the Wells took up this position over here, kind of as the Missouri Synod's smaller sister. And that merger took place, or that fellowship took place in 1872. It was called the Synodical Conference. It was an organization chiefly with these two synods, but about a half a dozen others that at one time or another wanted to be part of that movement with this as the core. The Eastern Lutherans, who'd been there longer, they thought that these old Lutherans were way too stodgy and way too stubborn. They had some really good things going on. They had moved, in the eastern part of the U.S., they had moved to the use of the English language. Unfortunately, they also absorbed a lot of ideas from Europe about the Bible being unreliable. After many, many mergers of synods, the ELCA today has ended up way on this left wing. Today, within the ELCA, not a one of their 8 seminaries will teach that the Bible is authoritative and inspired by God and thus infallible. The Bible is not the core for that wing of Luther. And part of that is when you've built your organization with so many mergers, you have to make so many compromises. It's hard to know for sure what you stand for. So there's just a much greater diversity of thought and belief. Some ELC folks that you may know probably would actually be more comfortable over here on this end. But the ELCA has put together, this is their strong suit. The older Eastern Lutherans in New York, Virginia, Maryland, the Carolinas, Georgia, there always were some Lutherans there. Almost all of those have ended up in the ELCA. The ELCA also attracted almost all the Scandinavians. The Scandinavians tended to be more pietistic, like they were down on dancing and card playing and drinking, but they were much more loose in their doctrinal convictions. It was sort of a more easygoing type of Lutheranism. And unfortunately, when you disconnect yourself from the Bible, you start to drift. You drift with what's going on in society rather than what you think are God's real words. They also were very big in New York, Pennsylvania, huge in Pennsylvania. And the ELCA has not one but 2 seminaries in Pennsylvania today. The one in Gettysburg that somebody asked about. In fact, that ferocious battle in early July in 1863 during the Civil War, the famous Battle of Gettysburg and Pickett's Charge and all that stuff, swirled around that building. And if you ever visit the campus of Gettysburg today, you can still see bullet holes and pockmarks from cannon fire because the battle washed right through the campus. It was initially held by the Union, and then they fell back to the cemetery outside of town, and the rebel forces moved in right through there. They also were very big in Ohio. They've got a seminary today in Columbus. They're very big in Illinois. And their real center of gravity is Minnesota. Their biggest and most famous seminary is in St. Paul, Minnesota. Then they've also got one on the West Coast in California. That's more recent and larger. The Missouri Synod, just to finish out the story, as the Wells saw it, the Missouri Synod was interested in dating one of the predecessor organizations of the ELCA. That final merger creating the ELCA was not until 1988. And it had a kind of a moderate piece at one time they were called the American Lutherans. And the Missouri Synod in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s was seriously dating the ALC and started generating some joint doctrinal statements, and in fact, adopted a joint set of statements in 1950 that totally freaked the Wells out. The Wells spent a decade arguing with the Missouri Synod not to let go of their historic stand on the Scripture. And the Missouri Synod, much bigger than the Wells, kind of blew them off. Like it's a big company, and one of their tiny subsidiaries is squawking and squeaking, and you just think, they're there. It's all fine. And sort of patronizingly blew the Wells off. And so the Wells divorced the Missouri Synod in 1961. As we see it, and I think most Missourians today would agree that a major change happened, and the Missouri Synod moved to the middle, where they tried to have it both ways, had one leg here and one leg here. And that, of course, is very unstable. And the Missouri Synod, there's so much to admire. I got 1,000 friends at least in the LCMS, but I'll tell you what, when you got one leg in two worlds, you're going to be fighting forever. And Missourians are known for their fights, for their sort of party spirit. Their elections were always bitterly contested. There was a lot of hard feelings. There was a lot of arguing back and forth. And there finally was a big explosion in the 1970s. And the most left-wing piece of the LCMS broke off. About 100,000 of them broke off and became part of this merger. And the Missouri Synod painfully, consciously, has now moved back. And today, the Missouri's doctrinal positions are almost identical to the Wells. In fact, if any of you ever had to move somewhere and there wasn't a Wells church anywhere near you, I would completely bless you and encourage you to get involved in an LCMS congregation, because their doctrinal position is just about exactly what is important to me, and I hope to you as well. So that's a little bit about synod politics. And of interest to us who are looking at the stories of Black Lutherans, that synodical conference fellowship that lasted from 1872 to 1961 not only was two church bodies being nice and polite to each other, but sort of knit together too, and had numerous joint outreach activities. And two big ones cost the Wells dearly. We had invested our part in the Missouri Synod's efforts to build a mission in Nigeria. So the larger of the Lutheran bodies in Nigeria, the Wells we had to let go of all that. We had to let go of all our investments, pull back the called workers we had over there, and let the Missouri Synod have it all. That was a very painful loss for people who've been working in Nigeria for years. Also, the Synodical Conference had what they called back in the 20s, it was called the colored missions. We wouldn't call that today, sorry. The word colored is an antique word that belongs in the 20s. It only hangs around a little bit today, like the NAACP is still called NAACP, not NAABP. It still has its historic name, but I'm mentioning that word. I don't like that word. I don't use it because I have a color too, by the way. I'd like to say I am a colored man. God assigned me a color coming out of my mother, and that was the cards I was dealt. And God thought this color worked fine on me, and so if it was okay with God, then I'm going to embrace myself too. And here I am. But this is my color. I hate the word color because it makes it seem like there's something wrong with me, like I'm missing my pigment or something. I got a pigment, and I try to like it and admit its weak points, but also be able to celebrate its strengths too. And I hope all of you are comfortable in your own skin and you are happy with what God has given you to work with in life. All right. The first, as I said, the first era. Just real quick. Sorry. Yeah. I know that's a really small thing, but how do that? Okay. I only mentioned the big three. I call them Papa Bear, Mama Bear, and Baby Bear. And we are part of Baby Bear, part of the Wells. There are at least 15 other Lutheran organizations floating around. And I didn't want to cumber you because the Lutherans are great arguers, and they're often very fierce in what they stand for, and will split. There will be splits and breakups of organizations. There are many others, and the Wells is in fellowship with a much smaller organization, as Lance said, called the ELS. It's called the Evangelical Lutheran Synod. They're based in Mankato, Minnesota. And their founding can be traced to the year when all of the whole Norwegian group of Lutherans in America decided to cast their lot on this side of the Bible discussion. And a little fragment of that, like about 5% of the Norwegians in America, could not abide that. They broke away and started their own organization, which was centered primarily at first in southern Minnesota and northern Iowa. And they took the name ELS. They're sometimes called the Little Norwegian Synod. And they have been wonderful, loyal, great friends and partners of the Wells. We enjoy them as our younger partner. We don't do any joint mission work together. They don't need us to do that. They've got their own missions. They've got a great mission going on in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine and the Czech Republic, and a few other places. They plant their own home mission congregations, but we reinforce each other. We call workers from back and forth. So pastors and teachers in the Wells and the ELS can go back and forth between the two organizations. We have a very fine college in Mankato, Minnesota called Bethany Lutheran College, which functions not only as their worker training school, but it trains the general population for a life of Christian leadership and service. Is that
Yeah,
something
no.
that their independence started in 1917. So the first era of, of white and black in the Lutheran Church in the U.S., I call there's three eras. Era number one is the era that I'm going to call the era of immigration. Northern Lutheran Europeans were pouring into the U.S., and it was all they could do to gather them up and scoop them up. So in order to connect with these immigrants, the churches of the first two generations of the Wells used the German language exclusively because they were overwhelmed with that challenge. That was all they could handle. And they just kept coming. And they would arrive in New York. Many of them would head for the Midwest. And then as the Great Plains opened up, a lot of German Lutheran farmers and Russian Lutherans, there was a lot of that too, headed farther west into the Dakotas. And so even today, Lutheranism is the predominant part of Christianity that you'll find in the Dakotas, North and South Dakota. There's a ton of Lutheran churches. Unfortunately, that part of the country is emptying out as farms don't need all that much manpower anymore. Machines do the majority of the farming now, and your farms get much bigger, and a lot of farm kids just say, I'm not going into the business, and they would leave. So the overall population relative to the rest of the country of North and South Dakota, in fact, the whole middle part, if you look at the map of the United States and you would look at the Dakotas and you would draw a big column straight down all the way into West Texas, that whole part of the country has been emptying out because that's farm country, and there's no jobs there. There's not enough jobs. Farming has gotten so efficient. You need fewer and fewer people to do agriculture, and the people have migrated to economic activities elsewhere. At the time of the American Revolution, over 90% of Americans were involved directly or indirectly in agriculture. Today, that percentage is less than 7%. So the jobs aren't there. And so that's all been kind of emptying out. In the immigration era, which is when the first Lutherans began arriving, up till, say, the time of the Civil War, the European immigrants had all they could do just to gather and train pastors. For Pete's sake, as I said, the Wells didn't even have a seminary of their own for 30 years. And they had some scattered ragtag efforts to train future pastors, but they were so desperate for pastoral leadership. They would take just about anybody, and of course, a lot of that leadership went very poorly because the people weren't suited for it. The Lutheran Church doesn't exist to provide employment opportunities for people who couldn't find work elsewhere. And the Missouri Synod was much more famous, had a much classier organization, and the talent kind of migrated that way. So the Wells kind of grew much more slowly. All right, that is never God's intent, that the tribes would clump together and then stay together in their own little tribe. First of all, God doesn't like it, and secondly, the marketplace doesn't like it either, because eventually the tribes, after they've survived, begin to thin out and scatter, and they start to move around, and your clump of tribes people starts to disappear. And if your only tool in your strategy is finding Central European immigrants just like you who speak a European language as their first language, that went away. They got away with it in the short term for a while, and the Wells was able to achieve some growth by finding fellow immigrants. And that worked until it didn't. And now it's time for the second strategy. German-speaking Lutherans always knew we're not supposed to hold on to the gospel. Remember, these are the years of not only slavery being legal. In 1850, the federal government passed the Fugitive Slave Law, and that actually forced northern people who were loyal to the government. There was now a federal law saying you must not participate in the Underground Railroad. That's the reasons that railroad was underground. It's because you basically were breaking a federal law if you were assisting escape enslavement. You had to break a law to do it. And Milwaukee had its own stories in the pre-Civil War years of the conflict between people who were trying to be loyal to the government, but also had a conscience and could not possibly contribute to re-enslaving people who had managed to make their way this far north. And I mentioned in the first class, Milwaukee has a wonderful visual tribute to Joshua Glover, and that is built into the on-ramps of the McKinley ramps to get onto I-43 and I-94. The Wells spoke the German language exclusively through the 1800s and into the 1900s. The official minutes of conventions and things were still in German into the 1920s. And it goes that far. St. Marcus was still teaching catechism class in German in 1925, finally ended it in about 1926, and went to all English. St. Marcus here was German speaking from its founding in 1875, and the first English language worship services were tried as an experiment not until 1914. They had an English Sunday school. The use of German in the school stopped in 1926, but there were still German language worship services here at St. Marcus until the late 50s and early 1960s. And they would still be doing it if there was enough people around. If there had been still a steady stream of immigrants who wanted it in German, we would probably still be doing it because Germans are very stubborn people. They've got that stubbornness is a poisonous thing, but it's also a great thing. Germans are very determined, very focused, hardworking people. They set a goal and they dig in, and they're like pit bulls. They clamp their jaws down on something. They don't let go too easily. So letting go of German was a kind of a traumatic thing because it meant you have to reimagine who's your organization and what are you trying to do. So a strategic mindset began to change, and our at that time brothers and sisters in the Missouri Synod led the way. And in 1877, they finally decided it's not enough to say that the gospel is for all. We're going to make a conscious effort to make sure that the gospel is being brought to people of African descent in America. Now all are free. And there was an enormous need then, as there is today, in education. And I'll tell you one thing, the Lutherans are not world beaters at all different aspects of church life, but one thing we get and are good at and resonate with us is education. The second phase, I'm going to call a missional phase. The era of missions. at home and abroad. And that's my first picture for you today. The Missouri Synod put a task force together to begin explicitly to do work among people of African descent in the U.S., starting in the South. And that missional era began in 1877, actual notable start date. And their primary areas of work were in the Carolinas and in Arkansas. So let's go to some of my slides now. Let's see what it's saying here. This is St. Paul's Colored School in Little Rock. You can see that building looks brand new, doesn't it? Look at how nice and crisp the roof lines are. I'm sure they were super proud of it. These were children who were not getting educated by the Little Rock public system. Lutherans built a school, and then there was a nearby church. And this isn't the era of integration yet. Remember, there still is vicious segregation in the South. All the Jim Crow laws were still applying. So having a mixed congregation was unthinkable. Nobody's brain could stretch that far. And besides, you could get burned down. The Klan was still riding in the 1870s. And so the existing political culture in the South would allow church groups to have ministries geared towards African Americans, as long as you kept them apart. And this is better than nothing. And here you can see the student body probably standing in front of their brand new school in Little Rock, Arkansas. And this is personal for me. I'll tell you why. That guy standing on the right, or to our right, is Ernst Jeske. He is my great uncle. And he was trained as an educator, and he helped start that school in Little Rock and taught there for a number of years.
What was their so I'm understanding uh, the immigration part, how they come over, and this is probably with anyone and everyone. You come over and you try to, settle in and get your roots down. Uh, but when it came to, well, I want to know what was the time period from the immigration to the missional work.
All right. The older Lutherans in the U.S., as I said, almost all of them ended up in the ELCA. From the Wells, answering your story just from the Wells was founded in 1850, and the Missouri Synod, our older sister, was founded in 1847. So this immigration time, when that's all people thought about and did, would go from these years up to 1877.
Okay.
Now that didn't mean that there was equality. There was still a terrible stratification in society of white people being on top and black folks tagging along as truly treated as second-class citizens. And yet, working around the social constraints at the time, doing what you could, the Lutherans thought, at least let us invest in how black folks are doing. And this, the Lutherans in St. Louis, assisted by the Wells, invested, raised some money, and built a training school. This was a prep school, college, and seminary all in one. It was called the Lutheran College, and you see the word colored up there. White folks would not go to this school. This was it came to be what are called the historic black colleges, which were set up. Some very, very outstanding famous schools today, like Howard University and Morehouse in Atlanta, are widely known today. Unfortunately, one of the benefits or one of the disadvantages of integration is that the need for the historic black colleges has diminished, and they're falling down one by one. Partly because black kids think I don't have to go to an all black school to get an education. I can go anywhere I want. And crazily enough, today, if you are a high school junior with a decent ACT score, you will find colleges lining up outside your door ready to pitch it to you because suddenly black folks going from being nobody wants me now everybody wants me. And it like has value. There's like value, economic value to being educated in black today. That's a overstate. That's a generalization. Like all generalizations limps a little bit, but I'm just saying this. We are living in a world that has been turned upside down. I'm giving you peeks at the old world, and this wasn't the answer, but it was an answer. And at least get education, get training to people who need it, and encourage, help them, and release them then to work in their own communities with whatever society at that time would allow them to do.
Building still standing?
No. In fact, the school is gone too. It it ran out of money and students in about 1961, but it was a rock for Black Lutheranism in its day. Let's see, what was the founding year? This is Emmanuel. It's called Emmanuel Lutheran College, 1903. So for 60 years, this school generated a lot of Black Lutheran leaders, the majority of whom would then work in the South among the surprisingly large number of Black congregations in the South. And a few of them began to migrate to the northern states.
Is that the same school that Pastor Grisby went to then?
No, I'm coming to that.
Oh, okay.
But that's a great question. That's a very good question. Here is Rosa Young, the woman who wrote that extraordinary book, and you can read her story way better than I could tell it to you. And I hope you're kind of through that. That woman was an incredible woman. I don't believe she ever married, and she was still advocating for education for Black folks, primarily in the South, until she was elderly. I've seen pictures of her at conferences and conventions, raising money and promoting awareness of the schools in the South. She's called the first Rosa. The other Rosa is more famous, the woman who wouldn't give up her seat. These are the kids from one of the schools that Rosa organized. This is in Wilcox County, Alabama. This is the school, I think, that Henry graduated from. I don't know if you can see it, Daniel. This is Concordia Selma. It was usually called Concordia Selma. And out of Rosa's energetic organizing work, a high school and college was founded in Selma, Alabama. Yes, that's Selma, the Edmund Pettus Bridge and all the civil rights stuff going on there. This became a very strong training ground for Black Lutheran leadership, and it's one of the historic Black colleges. Unfortunately, just like Emmanuel, one of the casualties of integration is the need for an all-Black college shriveled down, and eventually African American Missouri Synod people who wanted an education, if you're Black, would have now many choices, and they would say, I'm going to the big schools, I'm not just going to go to this historic Black college. Sad to say, the Missouri Synod sold the campus and the college was disbanded just a couple of years ago, like in 2017 or 2018, I think. Were you? Don't know. I've never been on the campus. The Missouri Synod has always been big into education, and they all their colleges, just about all of them had the same name. They all were called Concordia, named after the Book of Concord. And so there were about 10 of them at one time. There was a big one in Chicago, in the suburb of River Forest, still there today. Now it's been renamed Concordia Chicago. There was a junior college in Milwaukee that became 4-year. That is now Concordia Mequon. That's the biggest of the Missouri Synod campuses. There's one in Ann Arbor, Michigan. It shares a town with another school. There's another college in Ann Arbor you might have heard of. But Concordia Ann Arbor has generated a lot of call workers for the Lutheran Church. There's one in Portland, although that's also run into some operating problems and is kind of queasy. There's a booming one in Southern California, in Orange County, in the suburb of Irvine. So you might have heard of Concordia Irvine or Concordia, California. There's a big one in Austin, Texas, it's in Seguin, Texas, which I think is a suburb of Austin, isn't it? It's a suburb of San Antonio. Never been on that campus either. Concordia, Texas. There's a very strong traditional one in Nebraska, in the town of Seward, Nebraska. Now it's called Concordia, Nebraska. There was one in New York, started in Manhattan. They ran out of room. Obviously, Manhattan real estate is pretty tight. Ran out of room, and they bought land in the outlying town of Bronxville, New York, and Concordia had a Bronxville. There was a Concordia in Bronxville, New York, that served the Missouri Synod people who found an eastern campus desirable to go to. So at one time there were 10 Concordias. The loss of Selma knocks that number down. Concordia Mequon basically rescued Concordia, Michigan, in Ann Arbor, and now operates it as a subsidiary of Concordia Mequon. Big financial risk, but at least it kept the campus open. The missional era now spread to the north. A couple of weeks ago, I talked to you about the Great Migration. In 1900, the vast majority of black folks in the U.S. lived in the South in a big band in the old slavery areas from the Potomac River in Maryland in a big arc, which ended up in Texas. That big arc is where most black folks lived in 1900. In 1915, the movement began to start to move to the north. And these primarily rural people working in agriculture of one kind or another moved north and became city people, became industrialized. One of the people who led the way in this missional era, remember there's still segregation. White folks' brains, it could not expand to inclusive type organizations. Many social clubs, for instance, were whites only. Even the Baptist Church, President Jimmy Carter's Baptist Church in Plains, Georgia, did not let go of its whites only policy until the 1970s, during the middle of his presidency. That was big news that Jimmy Carter's Baptist Church decided we are no longer going to forbid black folks from becoming members of our congregation. It's that recent.
In 1970s?
Yeah. 1975, I think, they finally ended their whites only policy. It's
church?
Yeah. It is painful to talk about this, and I'm not enjoying this part of my story.
Wow.
And I'm explaining how we got to where we are today. Segregation was not just in the South. Governor Wallace said segregation yesterday, segregation today, segregation forever. The Supreme Court of the United States in 1896 actually made a national decision that it was legal and within our Constitution. And you remember the key phrase coming out of Plessy versus Ferguson? Separate but equal. You know that painful thing. That decision provided legal cover for what turned out to be separate and not equal. There was plenty of separation. That part of Plessy versus Ferguson was very enthusiastically embraced, and that decision gave legal cover to segregation. The equality part, people just flipped that off and ignored it. There was no equality of educational and business opportunity throughout the first 2/3 of the 20th century in the U.S. Marmaduke Carter was an exceptional, brilliant entrepreneur, and he established a church for black folks, for Lutherans in Chicago. And he was all in, worked his butt off to build this little church. Was so proud that there was a place for black Lutherans in Chicago. You want to know how hard he worked? Since he knew that many of the people that he served were very poor and didn't have much money and couldn't put together enough to buy land and build a building. He learned German so that he could go around and ask German Lutherans for money. Isn't that cool? What a cool guy. He just said, this is the mountain I'm up against, so I'm going to climb it, and I'm going to get it done. I'm going to find a way to bring resources together. And that church is still in existence in Chicago today. Here he is in the World War I years. These three young people there, he just baptized them. Somebody managed to take a picture of that wonderful event. Isn't that just the coolest thing? There he stands, and those three kids look so proud, don't they? And their parents dressed them absolutely to the nines. They were looking good. Here's St. Philip's in Chicago today. Philip was a great name for a black church, right? Because, you know, the Ethiopian who got baptized by Philip. Nobody actually knows the guy's name. Isn't that kind of painful? I got a few bones to pick with God. I got mostly God is pretty cool and he doesn't need my advice, but I could have suggested, dear Lord, tell us the guy's name, not just the Ethiopian. And then he's a eunuch too, which we won't even go there. But Philip was a name that that an all-black church gravitated to because they celebrated the fact. In fact, it's kind of an amazing story. Those were the first Gentile. That was the first Gentile we know of that came into the Christian faith. All of the first generation of Christians after Jesus' resurrection and ascension were all Jewish. That African was the first Gentile we know of. He's the first of a mighty wave, so that today the Gentile Christians vastly outnumber Christians of Jewish descent.
Where is it, St. Philip?
It's on today. It is in the neighborhood of Chicago called Woodlawn. It's on the south side of Chicago today, in the 3000 block. Probably not too far.
Yeah.
You could Google it and get the address up if you want. St. Philip's, Chicago, still there.
Jump road trip someday.
Yeah, well, I think it'd be fun to talk to them. They got an African American pastor who's quite a pistol, I guess. That was in 1924 when he did that. The Wells was a little behind, but cared about this stuff. As I said, back in the 20s and 30s and 40s, the Wells and the Missouri Synod had a partnership. There wasn't a merger, but it was like brothers working together. And the Wells and Missouri together cared enough about black folks to develop and invest in what Rosa Young had started and built and developed a lot of black churches and schools in the South, Florida, Georgia, primarily, Alabama, and Mississippi, the deep South, the old South. And also invested and sent missionaries to Nigeria, and quite a booming black church in Nigeria was a result of that synodical conference work. You won't hear too many Wells people proud of that or knowledgeable about it, because when we divorced the Missouri Synod, we had to turn over the keys, and all of our assets and whatever pride or happiness we had from this mission work evaporated, and the Missouri Synod got it all, because we felt we had to get out, and so we couldn't participate with them any longer. But the Wells did care about that, and in the Milwaukee area, as the missional age was moving along, you could also call this the age of segregation. Segregation was everywhere, not just in the South, but there was a subtler but just as nasty form of segregation in the North as well. In my childhood, any Milwaukee restaurant, at any time they felt like it, could refuse service to a black person. In the 1950s, in my childhood, you just could do that, and the police would let you. I talked to you 2 weeks ago. I talked to you about all the different ways there were of holding black economic development down. This is a painful fact. I'm just telling you this to explain some of the reasons why, let's say, the average net worth of a black family today is so far behind a white family. Big chunk of inheritable wealth comes in real estate. If you aren't passing a home onto your children, they're going to be renters, right? If you were a renter your whole life, you're not amassing capital. Ron is a realtor. He'll explain this to you anytime you want in a little greater detail. But the advantages of home ownership for capital accumulation are enormous, because you're paying yourself instead of paying a bank somewhere. And there was plenty of segregation in the North. And up to the 1950s, when the civil rights movement began in earnest and began to really get some traction, like things have got to change in this country. Up until that time, segregation was accepted as a way of life. And even in the North, a lot of white folks they justified it by using the same stupid argumentation that people in the South used to justify slavery. Like black folks were happy in slavery; they wrecked a good thing. If they just would have, they'd be taken care of, and they would have been fine. Like they didn't mind. Uh, White folks are smarter than black folks. It's our destiny to be the government, and for black folks to be the followers. There were 100 stupid justifications uh, that white folks would use to assure them that this was okay, that this segregation and two class of citizens was okay. But still, the gospel needs to be spread, and every white Lutheran leader up here in Wisconsin knew it and wanted to do something about it. But what to do? So Wells, in the late 1940s, in the Milwaukee area, the Wells churches put together a team to start looking where to get a start in Black Milwaukee. By now, Bronzeville used to only go from about State Street up to North Avenue and 3rd Street to 12th, as I said. By the 1950s, with a great influx of black folks from the South coming up to Wisconsin, especially the cities, mainly not so much Madison. Madison has a very small black population relative to its size, even today, but Milwaukee especially, and also Racine, began to attract large numbers of black folks, and they began to grow past the old Bronzeville and were moving north and acquiring property, were buying homes and renting places, and northwest along the Fond du Lac Avenue corridor. Those were the areas of the black growth in Milwaukee. And the white leaders knew we need to do something to make sure that spiritual needs of black folks are being cared for. So it's not the answer, but it is an answer, and it sure is better than nothing. So they commissioned a pastor in 1953 to do some canvassing in Bronzeville to see if there were unchurched people who were interested in what the Lutheran Church had to bring, knowing that it was going to be a separate, but of course equal, ministry. And believe it or not, he worked for a year. He kind of got sick. He had some health issues and had to bail out of it. But he spent the first year and started Bible studies in 2 homes. And they called another pastor to replace him. The first guy's name was Bertram Sauer, and they called next a guy named Paul Nickelbein. Yeah,
Up in Michigan. Right?
yes, yes, indeed. Paul was a pastor who had the itch. He figured anytime he got a call, it was God's voice, and he took every call he got. I think he bounced around. I think he had probably 12 or 13 different places that he served. But he came to Milwaukee in 1954 and continued those Bible studies and aggressively canvassed and met people, talked to people, and actually collected a critical mass necessary for establishing a congregation. And one of his crowning achievements is in just 1 year's work, St. Philip's Lutheran Church of Milwaukee was organized and chartered. At first, just like I told you that the AME Church is called the Church of the Anvil because they met in a blacksmith shop. St. Philip's likes to call itself the Broom Factory Church because that was their first place of worship, a converted broom factory. And they worshipped in that space, humble space, for a couple of years. And then in the late 50s, they acquired the old building of St. Matthew's Lutheran Church. Now it's on 84th and Malvina. But back in the day, it used to be on 10th and Garfield. And so St. Philip's took up residence, and they had a beautiful building. It was old, but a grand building, and they worshiped there and began to grow until, unfortunately, remember another one of the stories I said was how the freeways blasted through and how black folks felt that particularly keenly. A lot of white grumbling went on because if you can imagine, there was homes and businesses and churches and parks and all kinds of stuff underneath what is now our big freeway system. Something had to be torn down for those highways to be built. It hit the blacks the hardest, though, because it seemed like that freeway was cruelly planned to go right through the middle of their community. And so you'll hear, even today, you'll hear sometimes social rights, social justice people saying that the freeway system was racist. Well, I think it's more accurate to say it had a big impact on the black community largely negative. Long term, you're glad for the freeway because you probably drive on it every day. But in the short term, you can understand the pain of dislocation when this blasts through and essentially cuts your community in half. Well, the freeway was going to pass within a block of St. Matthew's, and they were told you have to leave. Now, as it happens, you can still visit the vacant lot where their campus is today. They could have left it there. St. Philip's could still be worshiping in that church if they had chosen. They didn't have to leave. So someday maybe there's somebody still alive who remembers exactly, did they choose to leave or were they out and out forced, or like was their land condemned by the freeway project and they were forced to leave. But they left anyway, and it's okay because God loves St. Philip's. He's crazy in love with St. Philip's. And they were able to nab a wonderful property on First and Chambers, whose Lutheran congregation saw how black the neighborhood was now and said, we've run out of our people. So they merged with a small little church in Whitefish Bay. And this church, at one time called Divine Charity Lutheran, now is called Divinity Divine Charity. And they're in business even today on Henry Clay Boulevard in Whitefish Bay. Although shrunk, wait, you gotta leave?
Unfortunately.
So that's,
We'll have the recording for you.
have I offended you in some way? No. Your audience is walking out on you. I don't know. Can I step on? Can I put my foot in something?
Do you give me an apple? You want an apple to go?
Well, you're giving away computers and
More
phones?
concerned about what's in there. There you
Oh,
go.
now you're
I
saying
gotta
that.
have that.
Muffin.
Grab both. Grab an apple too.
No, I'll take this.
That's your trophy wife at work.
It's your mother, actually.
Oh, mother.
We'll see you next week, guys.
Bye-bye.
I see you later. Have a good one.
So in the 60s and 70s, this was St. Philip's. The upside is they got a really nice building of a size that worked for them, and they also used the basement to launch St. Philip's Lutheran School. And the Wells, while of course still with this segregation mindset, were not able to expand out of that. The fact is that they lavished resources on this place and made sure they got quality teachers and got quality pastors too. They had some phenomenal pastors in the 70s who did a ton of evangelism, and the church grew up and exploded in growth. And very soon, there were 3 or 4 classrooms jammed into the basement here, and they began itching for a place to expand. And St. Philip's School today is still going full bore. They are still squashed. They got a much bigger campus now, but if you've been in St. Philip's lately, they're having classrooms in a cloakroom and on the stage of the gym and in the corner of the lunchroom, and they're busting at the seams.
And it's hot on the third floor.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, God is smiling on this little group, and He's just saying, in God's eyes, He wants to send resources to you. In 1980, it happened again, just as the white Lutheran Church could not imagine how to do ministry in a black neighborhood and left. The traditional old Lutheran church here, Jerusalem Lutheran on Holton and Chambers, founded in 1893, also, while being open to black folks, did not really know how to build a thriving community, and possibly their pastoral leadership was not the strongest that there ever was. And Jerusalem not disorganized, went out of business. They dissolved in 1980, I think, 1980. And St. Philip's acquired their campus, and now they not only got an even bigger church to work in, a bigger sanctuary, but they got the old Jerusalem School, which had been rebuilt in the 1950s, so it was all brick and it was really nice. So now they operated it jointly. Actually, they didn't. I spoke too fast. They didn't go out of business in 1980. They invited St. Philip's to have their services in that building. Do you think they would merge the two? No. They had the white folks service at like 8:30, and the black folks service was like at 10 or something like that, or 10:30. And eventually that white group shriveled up. Initially, they merged the two schools. Jerusalem still had a school going. Most of the kids were black. and they called it Beautiful Savior Lutheran School for about 20 years. I think it was not until 2000 that Jerusalem officially disbanded, and now the whole enterprise is called St. Philip's. And God has so blessed them that they are busting at the seams in their building. And see, one advantage St. Marcus had over St. Philip's is our neighborhood was worse. So we had a lot more vacant lots and really trashed, beat up housing. The houses along Holt Street are fairly decent. You know, they're maybe a little rough around the edges, but the housing stock has held on. And the whole River West neighborhood behind it, you don't see many vacant lots in River West, do you? There's not been too many houses condemned or burnt down in the River West. People are very ferocious about keeping up their places. And even west of Houghton, into the Harambe neighborhood, the housing stock wasn't so bad. So we had an easier time of it acquiring a bigger campus by land acquisition because the properties had become so distressed we could buy them for a song. St. Philip's doesn't have that luxury today in 2021. They would love to own the rest of the block, but it's going to take a long, hard slog to be able to expand. And they've hit a bump that their adjacent owner does not want to sell. So they got some work that they're going to have to do if they want to expand their school. But by golly, they're going to try to educate every kid they can. And they somehow, I think, packed about 200 kids into that building. That wasn't built for it. But it's a great story. And St. Philip's is thriving today. Here's some of their members. You can see their pastor, one of our precious jewels in the wells, only about a dozen African American pastors. Here's one in the white robe in the middle. That's Pastor Ray Kimbrough. Most of you know him. I think he's well worth getting to know. Ray has been a steady Eddie. He is rock solid and loves his people. It's a pleasure to watch him work. I've been to church there a few times. He will stand every day out at the curb and he will personally greet all the kids as they come in, and is an outstanding example of pastoral care for people. And God has blessed their work at St. Philip's.
When did Pastor Kimbrough get there?
Let's see. Probably about 1990s.
Okay.
So he's been there for 20 years at least.
I see.
Here's their gospel choir. St. Philip's gospel music in the wells. You know any of this book? Probably know some of them. Jack in the back row. Yeah. Bonnie. I forget Bonnie's last name. She's in the second row. If I wasn't a senior citizen, I would remember most of their names. I've been over there a while. I was their vacancy pastor for a while in the years before Pastor Kimbrough, and I just fell in love with the place. Great people there, and they are tenacious and very proud of being the first black congregation, black Lutheran church in Milwaukee. Very, very proud of it, and they are determined to make a go of it. Very steady, multi-generational. Like the kids and the grandkids are proud of it and stick around and keep it going. The second, that takes us to the end of this first era, and I'm honored to say St. Marcus became part of God's plan for Lutherans in Milwaukee to usher in the third era. We call that the era of integration. 1955 was a pivotal year. A lot of stuff was going on. It was the year of the Montgomery bus boycott. That was the year Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the bus. And integration now became national news, and black folks started to get much more organized, and with a couple of very talented, gifted, courageous, articulate spokesmen and spokeswomen began to make some noise on a national basis, not only in the South, but in the North as well. 1955 was also the year that St. Marcus School graduated its first black graduate. And that's a big deal. Some of the white Lutherans at St. Marcus were nervous about that. And it needed resolutions from the church council for every black family that wanted their kids in our school. And I not only admire the courage of these white Lutherans to break out of the old mindset and imagine a new way of doing things. I'm even prouder of those early black families that knew they were going to be isolated and were going to have an uphill climb to be fully accepted. And yet, there were families and kids brave enough to give St. Marcus a chance and were pivotal in the transformation of St. Marcus Lutheran School. By the late 50s and I didn't tell you how the pastoral leadership changed. 55 was also a big year in that St. Marcus's old pastor retired, Pastor Dornfeld, retired in 1955. He of course had an antique worldview because he'd been at St. Marcus since 1911. When he came, St. Marcus was all in German, so he was obviously fluent in English and German. So he shepherded St. Marcus to stop thinking of themselves as some Germans who were living in America and encouraged them to think of themselves as Americans. And he helped the pivot to the use of the English language and helped get everybody out of this immigration age. So the limits of his imagination was only into the missional age. But a crazy thing happened in 1955. St. Marcus is now vacant. They called, of all people, Pastor Nickelbein from St. Philip's. Was this a good idea? On the surface of it, it's a terrible idea. St. Philip says his baby just got born, and it's like you take the parents away from the baby and left to fend for themselves. I don't know how St. Philip's made it, but those tough people wouldn't quit. They asked the Wells, how do we get another pastor? St. Marcus just robbed us of our pastor, and they got him a very high-quality next pastor. His name was Milton Burke, and put a decade of very excellent work in shepherding their congregation. St. Marcus decides to roll the dice on a guy who just planted a black church. What do you think's going to be on his mind? So even in the interviews with the church council in 1955, and this is actually in the minutes, I actually read it, but the church council says to Pastor Nickelbein, if you get any ideas about bringing any black families in, we suggest that you tell them they'd be happier at St. Philip's. Pretending to care about them, but really they're still in the segregationist mentality. And Pastor Nickelbein said, I'm not going to do that. So he had a kind of contentious relationship with some of the long-term white members, but he wouldn't quit. And by the time of the end of his ministry in 1967, St. Marcus had now a critical mass of black families, and St. Marcus was integrated to state. As far as I know, St. Marcus is the first Lutheran church in Milwaukee, and certainly in the whole Wells, that became functionally truly integrated, where there wasn't just more than a few tiny little pockets of non-white people, but where there were significant numbers. And the school almost died, but for reasons I'll get to in a few minutes, it got rejuvenated. And this was a couple of years ago. I shot a picture of some of the kids in chapel. Look at, they're packing the pews. There's an army of people. Today, St. Marcus has a solid reputation in Milwaukee's black community as a decent place where your kids will be safe, where they'll be looked after, where they'll get a good education, and where they'll be networked into success in future life in their high school years. The next challenge, which you are very aware of, is for the longest time, St. Marcus had all white teachers. The next level is not only are you serving black folks, like having a colored church or a colored mission where you're bringing the gospel to people, but now, as in a segregated way, now you're integrated, but you're still got all white leadership. Now the next level is to develop black leadership. And I know our superintendent, Henry Tyson, cares passionately about that issue and has been busting his brain to find ways to get African American, not just students, but leadership into the classrooms. And this is not our North Campus faculty in their finest professional moment. Happened to catch a picture of them fooling around on a dress-up day. But I just thought that was a wonderful illustration of the diversity, not just in our student body, but in the teaching leadership, the professionals who are doing that work.
I think that was called Run TNC.
Yes.
I think that, I like remember that. I like remember that moment. It's like, Connie Harp's hair is the best. Yeah, that's
Time in 1949, the Wells also had been grieving their loss, or what was going to become the loss of the Nigerian mission. And the Wells said, we got to stay engaged with Africa. And the Wells commissioned two pastors to go on an exploratory trip, someplace where Christianity was not as yet planted in Africa. And they went through South Africa. They bought and outfitted like a truck, really. It's called a power wagon with four-wheel drive and enormous nubby tires because there weren't many paved roads in Central Africa back then. And they drove about 2,000 miles through Namibia, through Zambia, Rhodesia, what was called Rhodesia back then, and Malawi, back to South Africa. Came back with a report and said, we need to go to Zambia. There's no other Christian groups working there, and these people need the gospel. Let's do it. So the Wells adopted their recommendations, raised the money, and funded a ministry both in the countryside in what's called the bush, where they established preaching stations all around because nobody had vehicles back then. You can only go to church as far as you could walk, and in Lusaka in the big city. So there was an urban church and a string of bush churches in the early 50s. And about 10 years later in the 60s, that work was attracting people who wanted to come and study at the Bible Institute that had been planted there in Lusaka. And work began in the neighboring country of Malawi as well. And this is a great success story. There's probably 70 or 80,000 black Lutherans in Central Africa now because of that decision and the investment of the Wells into Central Africa back then.
John's been there.
A lot of black Lutherans. That's all I see.
When St. Marcus broke the ice and showed that you could have an integrated congregation, it began to move the needle of the thinking to go from missional and segregated to integrated. And one of the next churches in the 1970s to integrate on a large scale, even though a lot of white people were fleeing this neighborhood like crazy, is Saloa on 21st and Nash. During World War II, Saloa was all white. Today, Saloa is mostly all black. And there wouldn't be a Saloa if it had not been for courageous who imagined a new way of doing this. Saloa also historically did not have a school. And in the 1960s, they started a school. Today's Saloa School is a wonderful campus and a gym across the street. Here's Garden Homes. You can see their 1940s church building, and next to it, the new building that was built about 15 years ago. Does that sound about right, Lance? 15 years ago. Wonderful new building, and Garden Homes is booming. They've also been given exceptional leadership that had the vision of an integrated community. Probably would love to. I bet their building is full. I haven't had any conversations with Topher, their pastor.
Yeah, what I believe is that they are really happy at really serving their size school well, and they really are. They're locked in there. I mean, they can't. They'd love to get some more property, but it's I mean, you got to park on the street. It's amazing they get as many people to come to events and church, and it's just jammed on there. But they really said, they didn't think. They said, let's say Marcus and others expand. We're going to do ours really, really well at our 240 size. And I would say they do. Yeah, that's what I mean. They do a good job, and they just don't have the press for expansion.
I was going to answer Damien's question about Pastor Henry Grigsby when I showed the Saloa slide and forgot. But Saloa has a huge claim to fame, and that's that they had on their place the first black pastor in Milwaukee in the Lutheran Church. His name is Henry Grigsby, and he had grown up in the so-called colored missions in the South, and then took a position at Zoar Lutheran in Detroit. That was one of Detroit's historic all-black congregations. And then, as he was nearing retirement age, Rolf Westendorf, the pastor at Saloa at that time, knew of him and said, "Don't retire. please come to Milwaukee. We've got church housing for you. You can live there. Come and serve us with as much energy as you've got. So even though most of his pastoral years were behind him, Henry came to Milwaukee and really helped to bless the idea you can be black and in the ministry as well. And he became the first of what is now a larger group, a larger number. There's other stuff going on too. This is a shot from Hope Lutheran Church in Toronto. The neighborhood where the Wells decided to start their Toronto church ended up becoming a home to huge numbers of people relocated from the Caribbean. And most of them are people of color. So what are you going to do? You say, oops, we were looking for Germans and couldn't find them? No, they decided we are bringing value. They've created a congregation that's very diverse, predominating in people of Caribbean island background. And so here you see their steel drums. They actually have a member who makes steel drums. So their pans are kind of famous. And they have introduced Caribbean steel drumming into the Lutheran Church. I've heard them play. They played here at St. Marcus when they were on tour about 10 years ago. And they're just phenomenal. Because of them, Wisconsin Lutheran High School now has a set of pans. And so many students want to play, they have to have three like steel pan orchestras. They take turns. They have to take turns playing the instruments. You can see one of the Islanders, former Islanders. Hope exists because of another enormous societal change. There was great discontent with Milwaukee Public Schools here in Milwaukee. I showed you a week or two ago the picture of Roy Barbie, who led the desegregation efforts. It sort of didn't work. It called attention to the problems. I've read today that black kids in Milwaukee are just as likely to go to a non-diverse school as ever. But one of the big things that changed is a willingness in the late 1980s to use government funding for something other than schools of the Milwaukee Public School System, governed by the local board, the MPS board. And they were called voucher schools. And the state decided to intervene and provide this funding since the city wasn't getting it done. And there was strong governor leadership. The assembly at that time was in favor. The state senate was in favor. And I showed you the picture of the one of the leading black voices in Milwaukee advocated for it, even though the local black politicians weren't so sure they liked it. We didn't get much help from the Milwaukee political structure because they're all tightly connected to the teachers' unions in MPS who hate vouchers with a deep and unrelenting passion. They don't like anything about it and would rather put a knife into it and kill it off, and all the charter schools as well, because they want to own the system. They view charter and voucher schools as a threat to their lifeblood, which is students and money. The voucher and charter schools have peeled both off of them, and they don't like it, and they will fight it to the death. In 1990, those three political forces, the Assembly, Senate, and Governor, enacted legislation to allow funding to go to non-religious voucher schools that would whose documents would be available to all, but who were not going to be governed by the Milwaukee School Board. And there were about a half a dozen in that first batch in 1990. The Harambe School, whose building St. Marcus just bought, was one of them. Bruce Guadalupe on the south side was one of them. What was called Urban Day School, which is on about 24th and about
What happened to them?
Post.
The problem with those early voucher schools is you're only as strong as your governance to advocate, manage, hire staff, and then secure funding. And if you don't sustain that board of directors, you can run out of energy and run out of money, and things can start going haywire. And it's harder. It's hard to run an independent, totally independent voucher school. It's one huge advantage that the church schools have because they're backed by a stable church organization, which can contribute money and volunteers to help the organization flourish. Well, the results generally were pretty good, and in 6 years later, that same trifecta of the Assembly, Senate, and Governor were still strongly pro-voucher and voted to expand the vouchers to religious schools as well, the Catholic and Lutheran schools being the biggest beneficiaries. But also the Islamic school, Clara Muhammad's Islamic school would be included in that as well. So it wasn't just Lutherans and Catholics. And there were also now a few black churches who were like Baptist or whatever, who were interested now in starting a school. And in 1996, the legislation was passed to authorize inclusion of those schools who would wish. It went into litigation immediately, sued by the ACLU and the NAACP. It was in litigation in the state Supreme Court for 2 years and passed in 1998, allowing religious schools to enter by the narrowest of margins, 3-2. One justice must have recused him or herself because there were 6. I'll have to investigate that sometime and see if God made somebody sick or at the right time or how that happened. But it was a 3-2 vote by a pretty narrow margin. And St. Marcus was the only Lutheran school to give it a try in 1998. And also the only Lutheran school in it the second year either. And we had such a pleasant experience with it, waiting for something bad to happen or demands from the state's DPI that we could not comply with. We were the Lutherans were especially concerned about things like, would there be government mandates, for instance, that you cannot mandate any kind of activity. So it's called the opt-out. So are kids going to opt out of religion classes? And that was a worry. Like, why? How can you do your thing if there's no word of God? I mean, that's our heartbeat. We care about that as issue numero uno, right? So they said this is too risky. My thought was, what if we got to lose? What if that happens and we don't like it and we leave? If these mandates, any government mandates like you must do this or you must not do that, would cripple our ability to do our ministry, then we'd walk out. But that first year was worth like $250,000. My thought was, if somebody would offer me $250,000 to see if we in the state of Wisconsin could work together for the good of kids in the city, wouldn't I do it? And so St. Marcus jumped in, and then one by one, St. Philip's and Garden Homes jumped in the third year. And, now it's spread so much, even Luther Prep, the flagship of the Wells for high school age kids, their Pride and Joy in Watertown, Wisconsin, is now voucher eligible. And Wisco they derive significant support through those voucher payments. The Hope schools, how many are there now? About 8?
7.
Seven Hope schools exist because of the Milwaukee Parental School Choice Program, which has now been also expanded to be, there's a statewide component as well. And some students are eligible for the one and not the other. And that just makes it possible. Here's a little glimpse of some of the kids at Hope Premium. Oh, that is Redemption Lutheran School their governance decided not to enter the choice program, and the school died for lack of kids and money and desire. I think the real problem is they lack the desire. Redemption Lutheran School is on 68th and Silver Spring. Now they've got their school building. What to do with a dead school? Pastor Christian Winkle, who interned here at St. Marcus, said, "No way." Or he came to Redemption with that as a done deal. The school is dead. Just there's all these vacant rooms there. He said, "We got to do something." He did not think that he would be able to revive the school or get the church to go back on its decision. But he said, "How about a youth ministry?" Milwaukee's teens are highly at risk. They are too much unsupervised. They lack mentors and stable adults in their lives. Some of them lack food. They can eat at lunch, but there's nobody at home to feed them. So they built a program called Lighthouse in the old Redemption Lutheran School building, which has grown to such an extent it's now on 3 different campuses. And they got a brilliant, tenacious, wonderful bear of a man as their lead dog, their lead pastor, um, and James Buskey, who advocates for and spreads this place. Here's a few of the kids who enjoy the afternoon and early evening programming at the Lighthouse Youth Center. That also flowed out of this, and I think shows that in their hearts, Wells people really do care about how African American people in the city are doing. This is an example of it. This is a brand new enterprise, also flowed out of this. What are we looking at?
Just looking at all the kids there.
Yeah.
Kingdom Prep.
Kingdom Prep. This was born out of Wisconsin Lutheran High School. It was their governance at Wisco was pained in that they had limits to how many choice seats they could open, and the demand was far greater. St. Marcus 8th graders alone could stop up all of them, and so they were having to say no to too many people. They said, we need to start another school that is geared towards the needs of urban kids who have choice funding available. And they commissioned Kevin Festerling, who's a former member of our faculty, to be the planner and school developer. And it took him a couple of years of very hard work. But he was able, at just the right time, God kissed the plans. He leaned over from heaven and kissed the planning documents, and a campus opened up in a perfect place just at the right time. And the old Pius X school in Tulsa was not able to be a Milwaukee parental school choice, and their school died. They ran out of kids and money, so the campus became available. Kevin snagged a lease from the Catholic parish, and so they have a wonderful campus on 76th Street between North Avenue and Center Street, and Kingdom Prep is located there. They started with just one grade of kids because they needed to build a school culture, and so they did it one grade at a time. And God has just blessed their efforts amazingly.
Now those guys are seniors now.
Yes, all male. It's an all male school.
With the vouchers, because at first you had to have a building in the territory. That's why, and now they can be in the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program, right? Even though they're not physically inside, just like Luther Prep actually participates in it, right? And that's kind of that amazing timing where they had to close because they couldn't get into it, and then that location now is able to accept it because the rules changed.
Shining Star schools are also setting up shop. They're a charter school. They have a little different way of doing their business. That's a wonderful option too. Those empty school buildings are now full of kids again. There's I think 3 of them at least in Milwaukee.
It's Fairview, Abiding Word, and St. James, and then they have an all virtual campus too now.
That's right. That Delicia teaches that.
Oh, okay, I can believe that.
Delicia Washington, one of our teachers, is very nervous about COVID. Personally, she left St. Marcus.
I didn't realize that she was. I know Pastor Aaron Robinson's wife is still teaching virtual, even though she moved to Minnesota.
Chaplains in schools, which you know all about. I don't have to go on and on about that. That is birthed out of this movement because you've got now, between the Hope and Shining Star schools, and even some Missouri Synod schools, you've got schools that have no connection to a church. That means there's no pastoral leadership. It means the teaching of religion is at risk, and a lot of the people that have found their way onto their staffs are not trained in the teaching of religion. There may be Christians, but teaching religion is a skill to learn, just as teaching anything is a skill to learn. Just because you made it through high school math doesn't mean that you are now equipped to be a math teacher. You need to be trained in how to be a good math teacher. So we are thrilled for what Paul and what you guys are doing. Amazing things are going to come out of this. We're still in the early stages yet. The shoots are just coming out of the ground, but here's an example of opportunities and places to work. And Milwaukee, Wisconsin also has been kissed by God. And Black folks have benefited tremendously from new opportunities that have been denied to them 100 years ago. Here's an amazing success story. Milwaukee boy, Snowdy Sims, better known as Gene, is one of our delightful dozen black pastors. He is now the district president for the Michigan district. That's like being a bishop. That would have been unheard of in my childhood, that a black guy would be essentially a district supervisor. He is the top pastor for the northeastern corner of the United States for the Wells. Isn't that pretty cool? Did you know that? Ron, you're looking baffled.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
Isn't that cool?
Yeah, it is. It is.
Gene is a steady Eddie. He is an amazing guy. What's it? Yes, yes. His daughter goes to WSC, correct. The Wells has kept investing in and developing its African mission. So the Wells has a connection, still a deep connection with Africa. He was one of the churches in Malawi. It's like the choirs coming in to sing some praises. Oops. Don't go too fast. Sorry about that. This is an example of the work done by CAM. It's called the Central Africa Medical Mission. Anybody showing up at St. Marcus on Sunday, October 17th, will get to hear an extended presentation by Gary Evans, who he and his wife Beth are managing this clinic right now. It has there's a segment in Zambia, and then there's a mobile clinic in Malawi where they drive around to people who lack medical resources. And the thing is, these clinics are not trying to do the job of the governments of Zambia and Malawi, but they're linked together with the ministries to show that these Lutherans care about the whole person. Not we have food for your soul, but we also want to help care for your body. And health care, especially in the bush country, is very bad. Terrible, preventable diseases still ravage the countryside. And for 40 years now, I think this mission is 40 years old, and they celebrate their anniversary this Saturday. The Central Africa Medical Mission has brought money and medical resources and training. Beth is the nurse in charge. She's like the medical director of it, and Gary is the business administrator. Both of them are working themselves out of jobs so that Africans can take over those positions as well. Here's some of the people gathered for worship at the Wells missions in Nigeria. We lost our stake in our former work with the Missouri Synod, as I said, but the Wells is back, and we've got a supporting relationship with the Nigerian Lutheran Church there. The Wells has been in Puerto Rico for about 40 years. As you maybe know, Puerto Rico was, of course, one of the Caribbean islands. This is our first jumping place in the Caribbean as a synod. The majority of people in Puerto Rico are descended from the kidnapped Africans who were enslaved and brought to work on the cane plantations in Puerto Rico. So I kind of consider our Puerto Rican ministries there part of our African American family, as it were. Some are more Latino looking. You look at them and see, they're not black, they're brown. Whatever. This was the next Caribbean island where the Wells invested in. This is the island of Antigua. This is the kindergarten graduation. I think it's like a kindergarten graduation or maybe a primary school graduation or something at St. John's Lutheran School on the island of Antigua. As you can see, most of the kids are of African descent. We are thrilled and proud that ministry is booming and blossoming. And there actually is, I think Jason Richards is the pastor there, isn't he, Paul?
That sounds right, but
Jason is Caribbean descent himself. He's of African heritage himself and is the pastor there. So this is one of our. He's from right, correct. So this is Antigua, the island of Antigua. These are students from Grace Lutheran School on the island of Grenada. Grenada has a significant African descended population descended from the slaves who used to work the spice. They didn't have Grenada is very mountainous. You couldn't grow cane as well. There was some cane there, but there was a lot of spices too. Grenada is known as a spice island. Stuff that will grow there that will not grow in the United States. And we've got a very flourishing church and school there. Also, a lot of Europeans have chosen to live, retire, and for recreation, uh, travel to Grenada too. It's got big harbors and it's good for vessels. So here you see a very racially mixed group of kids who are involved. They're playing soccer at Grace in Grenada. And this is the fourth island where the Wells is doing some wonderful work. Trinity Lutheran Church on St. Lucia is also flourishing. The pastor at Christ Lutheran on Greenfield just retired, Joel Yeager, was in St. Lucia for quite a while and helped to do. So that is a booming ministry, and as you can see, the majority of the people on the island are African descent as well. So we're part of the Wells family too. So I was saying before, you thought I was messing with you when I said Black Lutherans are everywhere. You just can't always see them if you only look in certain places, but there's like they're all over the world. Last one. Yep, last one. So what else do I want to tell you? I don't think it's 10 to 6. I don't want to tell you anything. I want to know what you want to tell me. What are you thinking? Go ahead.
It's good to just see like a lot of places are flourishing, especially the schools. It just really surprises me that the Children's March in '63, that was still a thing, like segregation was still a thing. So like the Children's March it played a significant role in why there is not segregation right now. But I think it wasn't God's plan for that to happen, and it shows like the power in children, especially our young black children. Because I don't like if it wasn't. I don't think if the children didn't do that, I think it'll still be segregation now. Because Kennedy, when he seen it, like he was like, yeah, that's disgusting. Like it's okay as far as the adults, but like the children can't do that. Which really forced his hand to kind of like just try to end it. But yeah, I don't really understand that part of the timeline.
Well, it's the work of the devil.
Yeah.
Satan hates us being together. Since he's the loneliest bugger in the universe, he wants you to be as miserable as him. And keeping people apart is part of his work.
Yeah.
And the grooves and ruts of segregation are cut deep. You can't erase that by changing a couple of laws. People's brains have to be reprogrammed. Their hearts have to change. It's a spiritual part of our spiritual warfare.
And like even with like the school system now, like with books, like like outdated books and things of that sort. Do you think that's still like stemming from stuff that?
Yes, sir. And the curriculums, and the materials used in teaching always got to be looked at because white folks don't always think of stuff. They may look at a book and think this is fine and not notice all the artwork shows white folks in it. We're supposed to use this in a black school. The kids don't see themselves in its illustrations. Just little things like that. You got to think. You got to get your brain in a bigger place. Get your brain out of missional segregation mode and get it into we mode, they mode.
Yeah.
And that's our work. That's what God has called us to do. What you thinking, Kerry?
Uh, Obviously, I mean, all of this is great. It's great that we have Black Lutherans in all these different places, but I guess my biggest question or my biggest want is that how do you translate that into Black people in the ministry doing the ministry work? Like, yes, Wisco has 50% Black kids, but almost no Black kid from Wisco is going to MOC or anywhere else to work in the ministry. We have the numbers. What are we doing with? Like, how do we translate that? Yeah.
That's why God invented you and put you here.
In a way, but
I think I feel where you're coming from, but I also think that they don't know about this, like what we just talked about today. I feel like this is very encouraging, like to know that there's Black Lutherans everywhere. Because it can be intimidating, like knowing like if I go to this school, I'd be the only Black kid. You know what I mean? Like pursuing something. You know what I mean? So I would say that this needs to be taught. Like it does. Like I feel like it's good for us to know, but I feel like on a national level, like kids need to see this.
I was thinking of what Gary said 2 weeks ago. You said, man, I'm looking through the Wells website. Where's the emphasis on a passion for connecting with African Americans? The Wells is not killing it in communication, but I think their hearts are in the right place. And I want you brothers to really believe that Welsers' hearts are in the right place. They often struggling with ignorance. They don't know how to make it happen, but their heart is there, and they're trying. They're doing what they know, and they don't know enough, but they're trying something anyways, and getting some traction. And I just want to fan your flames in your heart, fan them into bigger fires to say we can do this. There's a tremendous platform here. Let's use it. And we want to help get whatever obstacles might be in your way out of the way, and for you to, with your heart, your face, your personal example, your reputation on the line, you could be game changers. Think of how much courage it took for that first Black kid to graduate from St. Marcus, knowing that what teasing he might have to put up with on the playground, or what his family being accused of disloyalty. Why are you going to that white church? What's wrong with our Black churches? And I totally get that. I totally get that. I've been to Black churches where I'm the only white guy in the place. Even not just some local little ones like storefronts around here. I've been to those too. But I went to New Testament church one time, which is really big. I went to Faith Fellowship one time out in Good Hope.
Good Hope,
I
yes.
was the only white guy in the whole place.
Hard to hide.
They asked all the visitors to stand up, and I didn't stand up. I said, "Y'all know who I'm not standing up." Look at me like I'm a snake oil salesman or something. In fact, I went to a Black church once where I was the only white guy, and they all looked at me real suspiciously. And finally, this one woman comes up to me and says, "What are you doing here? You a politician?" She says, "Are you a politician?" I said, "No, I just came to worship with you." "Oh, well then we went around, and I could shake hands and hug people and wish them well and pray for their ministry that day. And there's fear and suspicion, and that's our job, is to break that fear and suspicion down. And ignorance. Y'all are needed to cure us of our ignorance. Help us. I just want you to know our heart is there. Just our brain has some catching up to do. You got to help with the how. You've nailed it on the head. We are now building scale through our schools and education programs. Now the next steps are leadership development. And that only happens one by one with recruitment and with courageous people who are willing to go first. What Jackie Robinson and Hank Aaron and Willie Mays had to go through, so that Black folks were not just tolerated in Major League Baseball, but their talent could emerge and they could kill it and bring their God-given talent to bear. And you guys are all superstars making. And I just want to encourage you not to falter or give up or be fearful or worry about the cost. Look at all these ministries that you saw started small and high risk and with a running on fumes with not a lot of stuff. Wisco right now has got hundreds of Black kids going to a total enrollment of about 860. Their first year of existence in 1903, they had zero money. They had no budget. They had no money at all. They ran the high school out of a loaned vacant classroom at a Lutheran elementary school on 11th and North, and took volunteers who would come in. The kids didn't move from room to room because they only had one room. The teachers moved. They would get somebody who would come for a year and teach math to this classroom full of kids and then leave. Then someone else would come and teach science. And then someone else would come and do English. And they had no money for lunch. They sent the kids out to feed themselves as best they could. They would walk home or get a streetcar or something and come back an hour later and start up again. It was all girls. The boys came at night. The reason being, teenage boys in 1903 were expected to be working. All those teenage boys had jobs all day. They came back to night school, and the same thing happened. They had a rotating bunch of teachers who were willing to work for free just to help kids get a Christian high school level education. So God loves starting small. He thinks that's good for us to start small. God loves generosity of giving. When He motivates you, you're not going to get this unless you sacrifice, unless you sweat, unless you're willing to flatten out your head a few times, hitting a brick wall. And all of these ministries had hardships getting going. I've been to Grenada. I was in Grenada 10 years ago. It didn't look anything like it does now. It was a little ragtag bunch of people renting a room along the docks in St. George's on Grenada. And now they have a beautiful sanctuary and a school where they can be able to connect with families. So don't worry about starting small. Don't worry about obstacles. God can blow those all away with a puff of His mighty breath, His mighty word. Just believe that this matters. And I just want you to feel this is our story now. I want you to look at this and say, that's us. This is we. We're doing this together. And we're going to do even greater things. Because you're young yet. Youngish. Look at me. You've all got a lot more gas in your tank than I do. Sorry, I'm preaching at you. I'm sorry. You like spoke to my heart with that. I just had to get that off my chest too.
Well, that's really getting us because that's going to be the big. I mean, now that's going to be what we're talking about the next 2 weeks, right?
Yep.
What's the ideas?
What next? Where do we go from here? This is the end of your history lessons. Now we're going to do some planning and thinking. Now I want to brainstorm. I want you to dump your brain. I got a dilemma though you could maybe help me with, because I'm going to lay out some of my uncompleted vision, and I want to hear your visions too. Do you want to go first, or should I go first? Like, I don't want to stifle your creativity, but before you respond, would you rather go first, or should I go first? Does it matter? Doesn't matter.
Flip a coin.
Flip a coin. Paul, you got any advice? This is your gig.
Well, I think that's to be, because if you're saying, hey, I want to. I think if you have a lot of, if you have some ideas, like, then it makes sense to have you go first, like raw, fresh, because you guys are the outsiders. Like, you come into a place, how are you going to redecorate it? It's nice not to see how somebody already laid it out, to hear raw, fresh ideas without that. But if you're like, I don't know, I don't have an idea, then it makes sense to have some foundation. Someone's been thinking about it for a while, and then have a chance to react to it. So I think it depends on if you say you have something that you'd like to say, some ideas and thoughts, then it would make sense for you to go first.
I'd rather, based on after that, have Pastor Jessica go first.
All right.
Just to kind of see, because I don't myself have any ideas, but I want to know what happens, what's number 4 and what's number 5, like after, now that we're at integration and
Domination.
well, I mean, like with so many, I just like with a little bit what Carrie was saying. So we're at a point where we would think that things would be kind of shifting. I just don't. And if everyone's heart is in the right place, and I know things take time, and I understand that. I'm just, I haven't heard or I guess seen anything that is, encouraging, other than the fact that I know this is all part of God's plan. So I know that's enough. But you know how I'm a person, so I want to kind of like see or hear something that says, "Oh yeah, I can see this taking this shape." In even if I'm not around, I can see this taking shape when my kids get older. And just right now, I'm not seeing like what's the title of number 4. what's the title of number 5? I'm just really, want to know what that may look like.
While they were in the middle of these eras, those people who living in those times and doing the work of the church in those times didn't know what lay ahead either. They couldn't dream yet what God was going to do. My grandfather, who was ordained as a pastor in 1912, the idea never occurred in his head that the Wells would have significant numbers of black people. See, back in the immigration days, they justified their monoculture, their being all this one kind, by saying, well, all the different groups have their thing. Like black folks are either Baptists or Methodists. They don't want to be Lutherans. That's why there's no black Lutheran churches, because they don't want it. Nobody asked any black folks if they wanted it or not. He just sort of answered for them. That justified not having to make any black friends. In his own mind, he thought there's no way you can mix these groups. We're so segregated. Even President Lincoln, the great emancipator, told black leaders in America, "I suppose you'll be wanting to be freed and go back home to Africa." And they said, "What do you mean go back home to Africa? This is our home. We're Americans. We want a different America. We don't want to be Angolans. We're not Angolans. We're not from Angola. We're from here. We just want a peace. We just want to be respected and have the laws apply to us too. We want a chance to advance ourselves and our families without somebody else's foot on my throat. We're not going back to Africa." And Lincoln was astounded by that. Even his brain, as he'd been thinking about race his whole political career, his brain could not grasp that yet. It wasn't real to him. He couldn't imagine it could happen. So we got to do some imagining. Like, what if money was no object? What would you design? What would you design in step 4? What would it look like?
I mean, something to put in our brains too. That when I presented at Siebert, and if you take Wells Elementary Schools, and that's the future where the kids are. I don't know the exact. It was 18,000 total. How many of those right now are black students? Okay, St. Mark has got over 1,000, and you got, is it 2,500? That was my quick guess. Then if you say, well, let's look at the Hope School where they have Wells Ministry in it. They're not Wells schools. It's another 4,000 kids to keep it easy math. So you have 6,500 kids out of a total of 22,000 total kids in Wells schools. Well, even easy math tells you that's more than 25%, which is higher than the percentage of blacks in America. So in our school system, we're actually more black than the population of our country. And the question is now, what do we do with that? We have more access and more reach. That's all that has just happened since 1998. But that's really where we are. Like the number of people that have Wells Ministry K to 12, the percentage is 30% are black right now. So in theory, if that's our main source of workers, which it traditionally has been, that means we should start pumping out. We need to get it. We should look to expect 30% of the seminary. We're obviously that's a big. I mean, but our potential. I think what's different than 10 years ago. 10 years when I came at St. Marcus, it was a lot smaller. And then you add the Hope Schools in this ministry, and if the Hope Schools add in the next, they want to add 6 more schools in the next 8 years. And if those grow up, that's another 3,600 kids. And the other Wells schools are shrinking. Just think that's our percentage. I think that's what do we do with it? And we're really, we're at the hub of what we can do. What can we, is it that we need to have a whole chaplain at one spot? What ministries around? You guys have had some really good ideas so I think that's where, as a group, to talk crazy dreams, that's how everything that we saw today happen, was people going, hey, let's do this. And probably 2/3 of the things they tried didn't work. But the third that have done amazing things. So I'm looking forward to hearing what to do with the amazing potential that we have.
Creating leaders, right? Really replicate.
I'm thinking the same thing about our conversation.
Yeah, that's we get.
Yeah,
Here's what you can start working your brain on, because this will be one of my discussion topics next week that I'll bring up. Is our best bet to try to get a diverse student body to Malone, Minnesota, to the Wells Ministry College, or is our best bet to form a satellite urban place, almost
answer that
surely
one.
Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where we will train teachers, chaplains, and pastors here, and not send them to Minnesota.
It's not that you would send some there, but I mean, you gotta get it around it.
Well, we have come to our closing time. Thank you for your interest. Thank you for your questions. Good questions. It's been a little one-sided for the first 4. You've been drinking from a fire hose for 4 weeks. The next 2 weeks are going to be all discussion. We're going to lay out stuff. We're going to be just chewing on stuff for which we don't immediately have answers. But I want to hear your dreams, because that's how God works. He lets you become co-builders of His kingdom by letting you think a lot of these are my ideas. I got a piece of this. I don't want you to be passive, like I can't do nothing. I gotta drift along and see whatever's going to be happening. No, I want you to feel like drivers, like I can make stuff happen. I can dream and pray and share some dreams into reality. Right.
Can I close with prayer?
Lance would love it if you would.
Lord, just such a privilege to be here tonight, and it has been a fire hose, but it has been such a blessing to hear Pastor Jesse and all the things he did. Lord, I would pray that each of us would take this to heart and be solution finders, be about coming up with creative ways to be a part of the solution. Just bless these conversations and our thoughts and put them along with you, Lord. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Pastor Jesse.
You bet.